are back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Anyone who has listened to this program for any length of time knows that a particular irritant for me is the idea that people should, quote unquote, do what you love. And my next guest has written a book explaining why my sort of ungrounded, nebulous irritation is actually got a basis in sociological reality. At least that's the way I took it when I read the book. Erin Cech is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. She researches the way that seemingly benign and taken for granted cultural beliefs, such as, quote unquote, you should do what you love, reproduce workforce inequality. And and I should also say her book is The Trouble with Passion: How Searching for Fulfillment at Work Fosters Inequality. So, Professor Erin Cech, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Richard. It's a pleasure.
Well, it was a pleasure reading your book. For those of you who are watching on cable TV or online, I think you can see it there. Let me just make sure I do the promo thing correctly there. That trouble, you can see it. Okay. So you talk a little bit, Erin Cech, in this book about, you begin by talking a little bit about how you came to write it, and a little bit of irony, right? Because you, first of all, I was interested. You said you were originally studying electrical engineering, right? And you decided to study sociology, which intrigued me because there's a systems dimension to sociology, right? You're dealing with systems and interactions, and so they're not entirely unrelated. But you say in the beginning of the book, well, you tell the story. I think you went back to your parents and talked about changing majors, right?
Indeed, indeed. And what I found was that studying people were a lot more complicated than studying electrons, and right. A lot more fun as well. So I started off my journey in higher education wanting to pursue my passion. I started off in electrical engineering. I was interested in assistive technologies. My grandmother was blind, and I really wanted to figure out how to develop better technologies to be more useful and accessible to those who had less privilege of abilities as others. And so I started to ask my engineering professors questions about things of access and inequality. And those questions were not necessarily something that they didn't know the answers to, but they weren't seen as legitimate questions in the context of engineering. Yeah. And so I sought other places where I could find intellectual tools and theories and epistemologies to be able to think about broader social issues of inequality and access in a more effective way. And sociology was there for me, and went abroad and had all these kinds of experiences learning more about sort of critical structural theory and Marxism and things, right. And decided, you know what, I'm going to pursue my passion. I'm going to finish out my engineering degree, but I'm going to go and get a PhD in sociology because that is indeed my passion. And for a long time before doing this research, I was an evangelist of the idea of pursuing your passion.
Well, what happened?
I started studying how people think about career decision-making. So when I was a postdoc, I started doing interviews with college students about what major they wanted to choose and what they wanted to do after graduation. And I kept hearing this narrative over and over again about following their passion and finding meaning. And these were students from a very well-off institution, Stanford University, and I expected them to be a little bit more economically oriented or prestige or success oriented. But for the most part, students there were promoting this idea that they wanted to do what it takes to find something that they love. And I thought this really flies in the face of most of the assumptions in sociology sociology and economics about how people think about career decision making. In those spaces, it's about how do I maximize my training to get the most benefit economically out of my career? Or how do I find a position that will give me the best access to stable employment? And that is really counter to what I was finding in the narratives of these students. And so I thought, wait a minute, I think there's something here that needs to be investigated and explored. And so I did interviews with students at less prestigious institutions than Stanford, did a survey of college educated workers, did some experimental work, all to kind of take this idea of following your passion and walk around it with a more sociological, critical lens.
It's so interesting, and I will get into more detail in a sec, but one of the, I mentioned in the introduction, this has been, sort of an irritant for me for a long time. I talk about it sometimes. One of the things I talk about is that one group I work with had their offices pre-pandemic at WeWork, at the infamous WeWork. And one of the things I noticed at WeWork was that some of the staff had to wear T-shirts and so on. And they had to be very perky and enthusiastic. And aren't we great getting together to work? Which annoys me already. But then the only staff that had to wear T-shirts that said "Do what you love" were the women, and they were all women who were cleaning up the place. And they wore these T-shirts that said "Do what you love." And I'm going to, hazard a guess that they were not following their passion. They were trying to survive. And so that's one irritation I have with it. But the other, and again, my mental model is very simplistic compared to your deeply researched one. But the other, which you go into at certain length, is that it struck me that this is a kind of neoliberal way of looking at the world, that basically says you should do what you love and love it so much that we don't really have to pay you very much to do it, right? So what did I miss in those sort of gut reactions to the whole do what you love phenomenon?
Well, I may offer you an honorary sociology PhD. That's pretty good instincts there, Richard. But what I think is important to think about is the historical context in which this is arising. So we are in a moment of incredible precarity of employment, and precarity that is quite equal across people with different education levels. So the kind of instability that was really only a marker of the service industry and blue collar workers has really now come to be a hallmark of white collar workers, people with a college education. Our parents, our grandparents' generation, there was a sense that if I get a college degree, if I go to work for a firm, as long as I do my work decently and the firm stays afloat, I will be able to have a job and move up the ranks. There was a sense of stability to employment at that time. And now we don't have that anymore. Since the 1970s, the decrease in regulation, globalization, moved to sort of neoliberal models of how to think about the workplace and the worker have eroded really any sense that we can trust our employer to take care of us. So along that historical arc is also happening a cultural shift from sort of the 1980s, 1990s, continuing on strong today, of an increase in expectations for self-expression and individualism. Right? The sense that everything in our lives should be individualized. Our cell phones, the covers of the shoes that we put, the browser skins or whatever. Everything should be personalized. Everything should be expressive and individualized, right? And so, the one solution to this increase in precarity could be for workers, especially the college-educated workers who are far more privileged in their access to employment than people without a college degree, to say, I'm going to double down on the stability. I'm going to find the most stable, the most well-paying line of work I can, and I'm going to dive into that, and that's going to be my goal. But that's not what's happening. The solution that many people are seeing to increasing precarity in the labor market is to say, if I'm not going to find stability, if I'm not going to be guaranteed any kind of economic foundation, I might as well just follow what I love. I might as well make my career an extension of my project of self-realization and self-expression.
I think it must have been 35 years ago that the French economist Jacques Attali wrote about the way that technology, in his view, was going to, and now we know it has, also chain us in a way to our jobs, make us physically nomadic. I think he called it electronic nomads or something, but physically mobile, but cognitively like linked to our jobs night and day, right? So it seems to me that part of the phenomenon you're describing and dissecting and analyzing is the erosion, since you studied Marxism, in the communist countries of Europe during European communism, is the rule was 8-8-8, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of recreation and private time, and then 8 hours of sleep. In the post-war U.S. Working class economy, the idea was you got paid for overtime, otherwise you had time to yourself. And it seems to me that one of the sort of control functions, or however you want to describe it, of do what you love, or the passion principle, as you call it, is to make people more accepting of this invasion of their private time and private space, and B, if it makes them feel bad, as it made me feel bad for years at certain jobs that I didn't particularly care for, that there was something wrong with me rather than the system, right? Is that on the right track?
Absolutely. And we see that no clearer place than graduate education, right? You have people coming in and they apply for graduate school almost inevitably with narratives of, I'm going to follow my passion into this particular graduate school program. And part of demonstrating your expertise as a graduate student is demonstrating your passion over and over again for the work. And so I think that has its own space of exploitation and issues around academia that is incredibly problematic. But more broadly, what it does for individual workers is it silences that sense of criticism that they might have had for seeking their passion in the first place, that has to do with things like overwork and ideal worker expectations. So even the very most junior undergrads that I talked to as part of this book, when they were talking about why they wanted to follow their passion, they often articulated very sharp critiques of the existing capitalist labor market. It is all-consuming. It is incredibly and has an expectation of overwork and work drive, and so in order for me to handle that, I better follow something that I love. And so for them, the passion seeking was a salve to the expectation that they were going to be working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And so that's problematic in a whole lot of ways, one of them being that it ties our sense of identity to our paid employment. It hands over so many hours a day of our sense of self to a space that was not designed to protect that and nurture that. It was designed to promote a profit motive and to support the organizations in which we work. And so that's a tremendously risky thing to do, to hand over that sense of self to an institution like the post-industrial capitalist economy. But another piece of that is, if you have a bunch of white-collar workers who are in an organization where they're supervising maybe other white-collar workers or supervising service workers, blue-collar workers, often the expectation is that they are performing passion as well, to your example of the cleaning staff at WeWork, right? That it is not just something that people do naturally, but it becomes an expectation, another form of labor, to perform work as though it is an extension of their identity. So an example of this is, I think, quite common. You can see this all over sort of Starbucks placards talking about our passion is to serve you. And so the expectation there is the barista, when they're making a latte, is making it out of their own passion for the creation of the latte.
Right. I'm sorry to interrupt, Erin, but my reaction to that is always, can you dial that back just to mild enthusiasm? That would be fine. It's plenty.
Exactly. You don't need to perform that for me. Yeah. Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. Please don't.
Indeed.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but I interrupted you.
No, I think it's where I was going with that is this sense of like there is the expectation of performing passion among a group of workers who have very little potential to have access to anything that would spark passion in the kind of work that they're able to do. One of the examples I give in the book was I was in rural Mexico, and I was with a group of people, and we were observing a group of brick makers, and one of the people in my party, quite well-off person, looked at the brick worker and said, "Oh, they must really love bricks," as though it was their.
I'm sorry to laugh, but it's just so alien from the working experience, isn't it? I mean, it's like
absolutely. But and that's sort of the bifurcation of class engagement, of being like who does service work, who does blue collar work at any point in their career, and even have a sense of like what that feels like in the body, let alone a sentiment that this person is doing so very likely because that is one of the only options that person has available. So I talk in the book about the way that the passion principle is not just a guiding principle for how individuals can think about their career decision making, but actually a prescriptive narrative about how people should go about seeking their work, but also an explanatory perspective, explaining why we see the patterns of occupational segregation that we do.
And, it also, and I think you were touching on it with the prescriptive, but it seems to me almost, I'm trying to think of the right word for it, almost as if an enforcement tool too, that it is almost a diktat. It's saying, in effect, you better love this, right? I'm thinking of a member of my family, who I won't embarrass by identifying her, briefly, I mean one night, had a job at one of those restaurant chains like TGI Fridays, and it was very much like Jennifer Aniston in Office Space, and they had to do the enthusiasm, the wow jump, and they had to, wear, it was the same experience of, do you want to only do the minimum to show your enthusiasm, or do you want to do more than the minimum? And in the movie, she says, well, then the minimum isn't really the minimum, right? But that's the whole, to me, it's insidious as well as insipid, right? Because we know it's insipid if you have any depth as a human being, but it's also insidious because if you need to survive at this job, you better simulate some enthusiasm if you don't have. Arlie Hochschild, decades ago, wrote a book, I can't remember the name, something like
The Managed Heart.
About how then they were called stewardesses, had to smile and show zestful enthusiasm for this, for serving, horrible men, and this sort of thing. And it seems to me that's very connected to what we're talking about here, isn't it?
Indeed. So Hochschild talks about that as a process of transmutation, of taking this labor that used to be done, that is we think of as being done with the hands, with the body, and moving it into a different register. In the case that she's talking about, it's emotional labor. It's the utilization of joy or excitement or anger or whatever in the service of the job that we hold. And I talk about the way that passion seeking, or the expectation of the performance of passion, is another form of transmutation, but it's a way of an expectation of an enrolling of our identity in our performance of work. And that in of itself is, I think, an entire different register than the expectation for our emotions to be part of it. Because we can leave and we can sort of retrain ourselves and retrain our emotions or in a particular way to reclaim those. But if we are led to think of ourselves in a particular way, and our job has control over how we perform that for 8, 9, 10 hours a day, that can be deeply impactful. And as you alluded to earlier, if we leave that job, if we pursue something else because we find it's not healthy or we are able to seek other opportunities, it feels like a piece of our identity is being ripped from us, and people can feel really unsettled in their very sense of self after leaving a job.
Yeah, absolutely. And for some reason, I thought of an old friend of mine named Jimmy, Irish guy, bartender, who wound up dating a famous actress. And she used to drag poor Jimmy to these parties with all these, wealthy people. And they would come up to him and say, "And what do you do?" And he would say, "About what?" And, which is the ultimate statement that my source of income is not my identity, right? About getting money. Well, okay, I do this stuff. But the reason why I bring up Jimmy is because that used to be the working class attitude in this country. Your job was not you. Your job was a thing you did to get money to do the things that made you you. Maybe it was your family. Maybe it was your kids. Maybe it was your recreation. Maybe it was your religion. Maybe it was all of the above. Maybe your friends. But the job was just I grew up in Utica, New York, which then was a Rust Belt town and industrial town. And, jobs were, your parents' jobs were, well, my parents were teachers, but, it was mostly just, okay, my dad works, at the Coca-Cola factory. My dad works at the Wonder Bread factory. But it's okay, but you get what I'm driving at, right? Mm-hmm. It's a transmutation of, I think, what it means to work in America, isn't it?
Indeed. And the very way that we talk to children about their path in life really suggests this. So the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, is currently expected to be answered with an occupation.
Right.
Not a sense of, I want to be a community leader, or I want to be a good parent, or I want to explore nature or explore different countries, or take advantage of the wellness in my body to, do various, sporting activities or something like that. And that really sort of setting the tone that we're expecting young people to identify their sense of self with their occupation so early explains why that question makes a lot of young people very nervous when they're trying to answer, because it's a statement of a sense of identity as much as anything else. And we just don't have the kinds of community anchors and community places of identity that we had even sort of 30 or 40 years ago. So I'm thinking about Robert Putnam's idea of bowling alone and this sort of the shrinking and disappearance of these more community-based spaces of identity. Part of this is kind of the secularization of the United States, but in other ways, we don't have so many more community places for us to go and connect and have a sense of self. And so the workplace is really one of the only places we have left institutionally to have a sense, to find and anchor a sense of identity.
And again, we're talking with Professor Erin Cech, C-E-C-H. Her book is The Trouble with Passion. And Erin, that's a perfect sort of segue into the next topic, subject I wanted to bring up with you about this. One of the things that has also bothered me about doing what you love is that it eliminates from the equation doing what is needed, right? So, some of the great leaders of history, great figures of history, have not necessarily spent their lives doing what they loved. I mean, I don't think Lincoln necessarily, name anybody. Dr. King had a very rough life, very difficult life, living out his beliefs, including his anti-war beliefs and other beliefs that, caused him to become very popular toward, name a figure, Gandhi, whomever. I wouldn't say they were, I guess they were following a passion for justice, but not this kind of narcissistic solipsistic passion for just what I love, me, right? So so it excludes doing what's needed. And so I was very pleased to read a sentence in your introduction that says, I urge career aspirants and workers to, you list a whole series of things, but you end it with champion collective rather than individualistic solutions to the problems of the paid workforce. It seems to be one of the biggest problems with doing what you love as a concept, or the passion principle, is its individualistic nature. And it seems to me that collective action, I'm a politically an activist. I hate crowds, but I go to demonstrations not because I love going to demonstrations. I actually hate there's something I find inspiring about them too, but the physical act of going, I live in suburban Washington, D.C., for getting on a train and going into, I really hate it. I do it because I think it's a good thing to do, right? And that's collective action. And I don't know if that's the kind of collective action you're thinking of, but I think that, if we want to be idealists, if we want to make the world a better place for people who are working every day, this kind of individualistic thinking is a relic of a dying age. But I've talked too much. So what do you think about that? About collective action?
I'm very much in agreement with that, including too many people in a crowd is a little too much for me on occasion. Yeah. What I mean by the need for collective action is sort of two pieces. One is the sense of what you're talking about, that if the need for pursuing passion comes out of this really deep-seated critique of the way that the labor force is structured, the answer of passion seeking is inherently individualistic. It's about individual people finding the thing that will quell the drudgery of work for them in their own lives, right? And so thinking about how we can capture that and lead people to use that criticism to think about participating, engaging, supporting collective action that leads to better working conditions for everyone, including the people themselves, is really powerful. So I talk about the way that educators should think about expanding the narrative about what good work can mean when they're talking to career aspirants and young adults about what their career looks like, but also reminding them that we can only make change in the labor force if we do so collectively. The idea of asking for more from our employer isn't going to get us very far. We've known for a long time that it really takes collective bargaining and collective action to make any inroads to make work better for workers. But the other piece of that idea of collective action is supporting legislation, supporting practices of businesses and other spaces of reformulating the way that we think about work and the expectations for workers, really dialing back that sense of demand for ideal work, the expectation that if someone has outside responsibilities in their lives for caregiving or outside hobbies, that they're somehow not as good or not as committed to the work that they are doing. The sense that we have to be on 24/7 all the time to be considered a good worker, all that, in addition to more expansive welfare social safety nets and better protections for workers and much, much better minimum wage structures and benefits and all of that. It really has to be an all-in approach.
And, I guess the last topic I wanted to raise with you, and you mentioned it slightly, is children. And, but not just children outside the kind of all of what we're talking about. And this might be a little afield from your project, and so I apologize, but, outside the paradigm, or not limited to the paradigm of employer-employee, right? And for what comes to mind is, it's been many years since I read Jonathan Kozol's book, Death at an Early Age, but about his experience teaching young children. But at one point he talks about seeing a poster, and this is in elementary school, I guess, that says, if you like history, your career choices could include, and then it says historian, school teacher, librarian. And Kozol says that he wanted to write underneath it, outcast, revolutionary, saint, right? In other words, he was like saying, why are we stunting young minds with this very limited paradigm of what it means in this case to follow your passion of history. Because those are like soul killing alternatives to present to a small child. And you get what I'm driving at, that even when you have a passion for something in childhood and young adulthood, that is channeled so often into dreary and conformist channels that that limit both the individual and the potential benefit to society. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yeah, and it is, I think, so there is the piece of sort of the stereotypes we have about different occupations and who is best suited to them, or who we would expect to have passion for one thing rather over another. But there's even a broader issue that is involved with this, and that's one of the key seats of gender segregation, race segregation, and class segregation among white collar work. So if we think about having a structure of higher education that parrots this narrative that, yes, all students should follow their passion, everybody should, find a career that really inspires them and that they really love. The idea is then, as people look to themselves and say, who am I and what do I love? But we know that senses of self are deeply gendered and racialized and classed because people are raised in class and gendered and racialized
right, of course,
social structures. Yeah. And so when they go about choosing these fields along their notion of passion, they end up reinforcing, retrenching these existing lines of occupational segregation. But the difficulty there is we give students more and more latitude to choose the kinds of disciplines, the kinds of fields, the kinds of classes that they want to take earlier and earlier. So high school students used to have very limited control over the classes that they take, and they have more and more control over what classes they will take, and more importantly, what classes they won't take. So earlier and earlier, they're closing off opportunities to learn and to explore arenas that they think might be outside their sense of identity and sense of self, but could be potentially very rewarding, very fulfilling, and very potentially economically useful to them down the line.
So they're kind of being filtered off into separate bubbles. It almost seems like an educational equivalent of what the internet does to people sometimes, just putting them in self-reinforcing loops based on what they already think they want. And if you have another minute, just isn't that setting them up also for potentially in addition to potentially not exposing them to things that might excite and stimulate them? You wanted to be an engineer, and then you discovered sociology even later in your education. Isn't it also, aren't we setting up kids for a lot of disappointment in a tough, in a world where that will not, at least as it's configured now, mold itself to your passions? Aren't we really pulling a bait and switch on our children?
Indeed. And when the career aspirants that I talked to, most of them, many of the people this happened to were often first-gen low-income students. They were much more likely to have this happen to them than students that were from wealthier backgrounds. When they followed their passion and something happened and they faltered or they failed, they much more often than not blame themselves, that they didn't have what it takes to follow their passion. And that not only was a threat to a sense of sort of security and stability and self-sufficiency, but to a sense of their very identity. It really shook them to the core in a lot of ways. But even beyond the individual people who are in this position of blaming themselves for structural issues that lead them to be have less opportunity for being successful, the narrative of passion seeking choice washes that entire process to say it is your decision, it was your choice to follow that passion, and it just didn't happen for you. And so it's not the system to blame, it's the individuals.
Which is something we replicate in so many dimensions of our society, from mortgages to, you name it. We have a system built on that kind of blaming, forcing people to blame themselves for systemic failures. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But I strongly recommend the book. Again, the book is The Trouble with Passion: How Searching for Fulfillment at Work Fosters Inequality. The author Dr. Erin A. Cech, C-E-C-H. Professor Cech, thank you so much for writing this fascinating book, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.